Back in 7th grade, we studied cells a fair amount. You learned about various cell organelles, what their function was, and so forth. We're going to continue that, so that's why we're going to move pretty quickly through it. It'll take us this period and a little bit more time to go through all the cell organelles. We will talk about each of them in more detail than we did and get a little bit more of the specifics of the organelles than we did in 7th grade. But the general function of the organelles, I think you already have learned, and so it should come back pretty quickly. So we already talked about yesterday prokaryotic cells versus eukaryotic cells. And what's the difference? Eukaryotic cells much more complex. They have a whole host of organelles that prokaryotic cells don't. Prokaryotic cells basically have a cell membrane, cell wall, cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes. Eukaryotic cells have lots of other organelles. Much more complex. DNA is held within a membrane-bound nucleus. So when we talk about cells, we often will sort of categorize plant versus animal cells. It's kind of an artificial way to talk about them. Not every plant cell and animal cell is the same. This also sort of ignores other types of cells like fungi and other protists and so forth, but we'll just sort of review this. So if we're comparing just plant and animal cells, there are some important differences. Are they both eukaryotes or prokaryotes or one of each? Yeah, they're both eukaryotic cells. Plant cells have several organelles that animal cells do not. So plant cells have a cell wall. Plant cells have chloroplasts. Okay? Animal cells don't have those organelles. The cell wall in plant cells is made of cellulose. What class of compound is cellulose? Thinking back to our biochemistry. Cellulose is
starch.
yes,
So
which
it's
is a
fiber. Oh, carbohydrate.
which is a what specifically?
Carbohydrate.
A polysaccharide. It's a large molecule. Both have vacuoles, however, plant cells often have a large central vacuole if it's filled with water that allows a plant to maintain its upright sort of stance. Another organelle, centrioles, are usually present in animal cells but not plant cells. The shape's different. Plant cells generally have a rigid shape because of their cell wall, whereas animal cells are often not rigid. Their outer layer is a more flexible cell membrane. And there's an organelle we'll talk about today called the lysosome, which is present in animal cells, but generally not present in plant cells. So that's just kind of cool. So let's talk about organelle by organelle, or cell part by cell part. So the plasma membrane. Plasma membrane, also called cell membrane. Very complex part of a cell. So we'll talk about it in pretty extensive detail. First of all, the plasma membrane, the outermost living layer of the cell, is selectively permeable or semi-permeable. Some materials are able to move through the cell membrane and some materials are not. Some materials can just pass right through. Others sort of need help to pass through the cell membrane. So all cells have this, prokaryote, eukaryote. And the structure of the cell membrane is, it's a phospholipid bilayer. Let me just move ahead for a second to show you. So phospholipid bilayer. What do you think the phospho part means?
Phosphorus.
Phosphorus. And lipid? Fat. So a phospholipid is, kind of looks like maybe a sperm cell. The head of this gray part, is the phosphorus part. Then each of those phosphorus parts has two tails, two lipid tails coming off of it. What do you know about lipids in water?
Low on top.
Do they like each other? No, they don't mix well. So when you take these phospholipids and put them in water, they arrange themselves spontaneously so that the tails are away from the water and the phosphorus part is towards the water. So they arrange themselves so the phosphate heads are facing out and the lipid tails are facing inward. And so that's why we say it's a phospholipid bilayer. There's two layers so that they can arrange themselves. So the hydrophobic tails that we said don't like water are not near the water on the outside. They're facing the inside. Now that's important because it is important in how molecules can pass through. Water-soluble molecules can't generally just pass through the cell membrane because of this central layer which is made of these lipids. And lipid-soluble materials often can just pass right through this because they can get through that central area pretty well. All right, so it's this phospholipid bilayer, double layer of lipids. And stuck within this phospholipid bilayer are lots of different larger protein molecules and other molecules. These things you see in pink, those are these embedded proteins in this sheet of phospholipids. Attached to the outside are often carbohydrates. Okay? And we'll talk about what they do in a minute. Another important part embedded in the cell membrane is something called a receptor molecule. Receptor molecules are molecules that are sort of listening in for signals from other cells. Cells must be able to communicate with each other in a multicellular organism. Hormones produced in one area need to have effects on cells in another area, for example. And so these receptor molecules allow that to happen. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. They're proteins that receive messages from other cells. Now this cell membrane is often impermeable to certain substances. They can't just pass right through and diffuse through. So there are other ways of materials getting into and out of cells. One of them is called pinocytosis. Here's just shows the cell membrane, this thin layer. So pinocytosis is often how small particles get into the cell. It's shown on the right here. Basically, these small molecules start to, the membrane on the, this is the inside of the cell, this is the outside. So the plasma membrane starts to indent, forming a little sort of pocket, and then eventually it seals off, and this little bubble is now within the cell, and it contains the contents that were outside of the cell. We call this a vesicle. So that pinching in is called pinocytosis. The sort of opposite is called phagocytosis, where you have the cell membrane moving outward and surrounding a particle, bringing it into the cell. If you remember amoeba from 7th grade, when they engulf their food, they do that using this process called phagocytosis. That's another way. That's often used to get large particles inside of the cell. Again, we have a diagram of the plasma membrane with our phospholipid bilayer, our proteins that are embedded here in various ways. Now, some proteins go all the way through the membrane, these integral proteins go from outside to inside. Some are only on the inside. Some are only on the outside. It just depends on the protein. Also within this cell membrane is some cholesterol. The cholesterol gives the membrane increased flexibility. There's also these glycoproteins, okay, and these carbohydrates that are attached to those proteins. We'll talk about those in the next slide. So some important functions of this plasma membrane. First of all, it's obviously a barrier from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. It also is used for transport. Some of those proteins that are embedded in the plasma membrane act as sort of a tunnel so that molecules can get into the cell that otherwise wouldn't be able to pass through the phospholipid bilayer. Sometimes those proteins can pump molecules from low to high concentration against the concentration gradient using energy. Some of these proteins are enzymes that allow chemical reactions to take place. Some of the proteins are receptor molecules listening in for a signal from another molecule so that some change can happen within the cell. These proteins allow cells to recognize each other. So all of our cells have little sort of flags on the outside that sort of advertise, hey, I'm part of your body, don't kill me. And so if a white blood cell comes along that destroys pathogens, it will recognize, okay, this molecule and say, okay, you're safe. You're a part of the body, I'm not going to destroy you. Whereas if it encounters cells without that identifying molecule, it knows it's a foreign cell and can then attack it and destroy it. These proteins help attach cells to the outside and one cell to another cell. So these proteins stuck within the cell membrane have lots of important functions. This shows a little bit more about how these cells communicate with each other. So, hormones are signaling molecules produced in endocrine glands. For example, testes produce testosterone, ovaries produce estrogen, pancreas produces insulin. These are hormones. They travel around through the bloodstream, and they have effects on cells in different parts of the body. And they do that by the use of these receptor molecules. For example, this would be insulin would be an example of this sort of communication. So insulin can't pass through the cell membrane. So instead what happens is it binds with a special receptor molecule that's in the cell membrane. So insulin binds with it, and then this receptor molecule releases other molecules inside that have some effect. Okay. Other types of hormones are lipid soluble, things like estrogen, testosterone. They can pass right through the membrane. So they are released, they go directly into the cell, actually go into the nucleus, and change how the DNA is being expressed. So that's another way for this cellular communication to take place. There's two different sort of models, depending on if it can get in or out of the cell membrane. Now, for example, insulin works on cells in the liver, telling the liver cells to take in glucose. It doesn't have any effect on our skin cells because our skin cells don't have the proper receptor molecules. They're not affected by it. So the receptor molecules allow a hormone to be specific to one type of tissue. Cytoplasm. Cytoplasm just fills up the cell. It's a liquidy kind of fluid. The organelles are sort of in the cytoplasm, sort of embedded there. It's mostly just water and protein, some lipids and carbs as well. Inside of the cytoplasm, lots of different chemical reactions take place. There's enzymes in the cell, in the cytoplasm. It's moving. Materials move in the cytoplasm from one place to another. Cytoplasm can stream. It's called cyclosis. You see that here. What type of cell is this? It's a plant cell. What are we looking at moving here? Chloroplast. Is there chloroplast? See, they're sort of moving within the cytoplasm. What kind of cells are these?
Animal cells.
Those are animal cells. Outer layer is the cell membrane. The stuff you see in the lighter color is the cytoplasm. The nucleus. Nucleus is an organelle found in eukaryotic cells. That's where the DNA is stored. And the DNA is stored in the form of chromosomes. chromosomes made of the DNA, but also sort of a protein that the DNA is wrapped around. And the chromosomes in the interior of the nucleus are surrounded by a membrane. It's a double membrane. So here you see an electron microscope image of a nucleus. You see the nuclear membrane, sometimes called the nuclear envelope. And you also see that there are these sort of holes in it, these tiny little pores, they're called, because things need to move in and out of the nucleus. Things like messenger RNA and ribosomes, enzymes. So within the nucleus is this part called the nucleolus. The nucleolus is made of DNA and RNA and protein, and its job is to actually make the ribosomes. Ribosomes are produced here. If we look at a sort of diagram here of the nucleus, the nucleolus is just sort of looks often like a darker area within the nucleus. The DNA sometimes is in the form of chromosomes, other times it's kind of just this thread-like structure called chromatin, which you can't really see very clearly. So the nuclear membrane around the outside, and then the nuclear pores that allow things to move in and out of the nucleus. If we look at the actual electron microscope image of the nucleus, here it is. If we view it even more closely, we can see these little pores. These are the openings of the nuclear membrane that allow things in and out. You guys remember what ribosomes do? Remember if I call them ribosomes? Ribs are made of meat. Meat contains ribosomes make. Correct. Ribosomes are the protein-making factories of the cell. They're very, very small. They're not membrane-bound organelles. They're actually just made of RNA, ribosomal RNA. Do you remember that cell animation we watched? The ribosomes are made of like two pieces, and they come together and connect, and then start producing proteins. Some ribosomes are really small, first of all. Some of them are attached to the ER. They're called attached ribosomes. Others are just floating within the cytoplasm. And those two different types of ribosomes actually have different functions. The attached ribosomes that are attached to the ER, they usually make the proteins that are going to be sent out of the cell, that are going to be secreted. Because they make the protein and then they're held within the ER membranes until they're released out of the cell. The free ribosomes that are just kind of floating in the cytoplasm, they make the proteins that are going to be used within that specific cell. If you remember when we talked about nucleic acids and proteins and amino acids, the ribosome is in blue here. It has two subunits. It attaches to the messenger RNA, which contains the recipe on how to build the protein. Transfer RNA molecules bring in the correct amino acid, which gets put together one after the other to form the protein. So the blue is the ribosome. The endoplasmic reticulum, the ER. This is a series of membranes throughout the cell, and the ER synthesizes material, it stores material, and transports it within the cell. It looks like a bunch of tubes when you look at it in the electron microscope image. And it provides a very large surface area where chemical reactions can take place. The smooth ER is ER that does not have ribosomes attached. This makes lipids, steroids, phospholipids. It also is responsible for detoxifying poisons and toxins. For example, in the liver, the smooth ER is what detoxifies alcohol. The rough ER, where you have these ribosomes attached, okay, that produces proteins. They're usually kept within the ER until they're going to be released, like insulin. And those proteins that are going to be leaving the ER for other cells are packaged up into these little vesicles, these little bubbles to transport them. This is what the ER looks like. It's near the nucleus. The rough ER has the ribosomes. The smooth ER does not have attached ribosomes. We'll have to talk about Golgi apparatus tomorrow. Zach, you have a question?
No,
Just stretching?
yeah.
All right. Continue on tomorrow.